Hi friends, welcome back to Industrious Bee. I am Melissa. This is Tank. We come to you today to he's already bored of the video. He will be joining me today as we discuss the concept and the word responsibility. I guess I'll start with the way that this word came to me, or how I experienced the word responsibility as a younger human being, as opposed to the insight and the meaning that it has presented itself to me, for me, in the last month. Bless you. Bless you. so, as a younger human being, I didn't like the word responsibility, and I think that's because I was always considered irresponsible, and I I felt myself to be irresponsible. Very evident by the way I was living my life, especially in my early 20s. I just was kind of just hopping from moment to moment and had no concept of responsibility. I had no concept of who I was, and I had no ability to be in the moment and understand that my actions had an effect in the future, not only for me, but for other people. At the time, I was so in a different world that even the concept of being responsible had no intrigue to me whatsoever. And of course, that began to change the day I had my daughter, and a year later, when I ended up uh, getting sober, I was able to a degree to start to take responsibility for my life and my child and myself. And I held myself accountable as much as possible during that time. And in the last 15 years since then, I have experienced the word responsibility in different forms. And it was finally really revealed to me about a month ago in such a true form and meaning that it has shaped so much of my last 3 weeks, and it has allowed me to confront circumstances in different ways than I normally would. And the way that it came to me, and what I feel important to share with you all, is how Spirit showed the word to me in a way that allows me to have agency over responsibility. And it just showed it as response ability, the ability to respond. And when this was flashed in front of my eyes, everything shifted for me in that moment. And the reason why it did was because in that moment, I realized that I've spent my entire life in most areas in reactivity, reacting rather than responding. And what's the difference? For me, I can see clearly the difference now. However, at the time prior to this, I really didn't have too much of an understanding or a concept of the difference. And the way to separate or find distance between reactivity and responsibility takes just a little bit of, at first, just a little bit of self-awareness. And when we can take a step back and observe any circumstance in our life, it usually has to start with a lesser triggering or a lesser emotionally charged circumstance. But any circumstance, say you're at the grocery store and you're going for a product and you go and it's not there, what is your response? Is it some kind of just instinctual, not instinctual, but just a reaction, like a trigger reaction of probably anger or frustration? Or can you take a step back and take a breath and take a moment to fill in that space between what happens and then how you react, and that then from that space becomes a response rather than a reaction. That is the difference between reactivity and responsibility. It was shown to me that as I start to understand myself and as I start to dive into who I am and examine my reactions, I start to alchemize that to a place where I'm able to respond rather than react. And I then have responsibility, the ability to respond. When this was shown to me, it jolted me and it shifted me. And at that point, what I was going through, and I'm still going through right now, is my financial responsibility, my, at the time, inability to respond to financial stresses. I have, like many people and that I know and in this life, were never shown how to be responsible in finances. I, like many people, moved out at, as a teenager, and I was kind of just thrown into the world of like minimum wage working, having bills, having to, go from being fully taken care of to taking care of myself in just a blink of an eye. Just did the best that I could. I would get a bill and I would have to react to the bill because it was just like, oh, survival. Like, oh, okay, how am I going to get the money together for this and this and this? And, for me, the layer that I've been working on is becoming responsible in my finances. So I can go to a financial trigger or a bill that comes in, and I can spend a moment in that space, internalize the emotional reactivity or the emotional charge behind it, not react, not have fear, not freeze, not go to what I would normally go to with my finances, which at looking back, it's either freezing, ignoring, or going and spending more money. But take a moment and feel the emotional charge behind this circumstance, and then have a moment to, or a many moments to decide how to respond. How am I going to respond? And within this space, I'm finding the ability to respond easier and easier, hence becoming more financially responsible. And it was shown to me through finances. And as I've navigated through the last few weeks, I'm noticing the areas that I have practiced and became more responsible in life with my emotional things. One of the most practiced areas for me is raising my daughter. I have a 16-year-old, and without knowing it, I have created responsibility with my child emotionally. She is a source of many triggers for me, as our children are. I believe our children become our teachers because they do offer so many triggers. And for me, the word trigger just is it literally is just a mirror. My child is a big, fat, huge mirror for me. She just holds up a mirror that I can't avoid. It's like a 360 mirror for me. And since I've had so much practice with that, I have created pretty strong emotional responsibility with my child. When she comes to me, or even she doesn't even have to come to me with something. Sometimes she just comes out of her room, and it could be something she's wearing or something right? Something she's eating or something. And it creates this trigger in me. And I have developed over the years, a majority of the time, the ability to realize that I'm having this trigger. And for a brief moment, I want to define or clarify what the word trigger is for me and the way I experience triggers. I get a very bodily reaction to triggers. When something comes up and it kind of transports me back to a trauma or a moment in time that I have become stuck, I get a very physical reaction. I experience life in a very physical way. Things show up to me as tension in my body, or clenching jaws, or gut feeling, or headache, or something. Or a panic feeling. These to me are my physical navigation system to know that I'm in a trigger space. And psychologically, what a trigger does to me or for me is transports me right back to that age or that moment in time where that original trauma was created. And from that space, before I take responsibility, before I'm able to respond to that, I have no choice but to revert back to that age. And I can only react from that original space or that original wound. And as a result of that original wound at that time, my self at that time, my highest self or my core self at that time, created a reaction, a way to buffer that so it could never happen again. So I created, a characteristic or a manipulation or a change in my personality that deals with anything that might ever put me back into a situation of being traumatized that way again. So when we're walking through life in real time and somebody comes into our existence that is a mirror for that trauma or that trigger, I go back into that age, or I go back to that, and I react from that space. That's a trigger for me. That's how I experience triggers. And I've had a great deal of practice in placing myself in situations purposely to put myself into the triggered space so that I can create the ability to respond rather than to react. For me, these things that I practice regularly are yoga, meditation, fasting, and plant medicines. I've done a lot of, I've done some like sensory deprivation type things, breath work. These things I safely and purposely put myself into a situation where I know that I'm going to experience triggers, or I'm going to purposely create a situation where I feel uncomfortable. So in a safe, controlled space, I'm able to develop this ability to respond without harming anybody else, really, and purposely putting myself in this space so that I can start to understand the way that I tend to react at first, put myself into this place, and I can observe the way that I tend to react. So, like my tendency towards reaction of a certain uncomfortable situation. And with that observation, I can then get an idea of how I would prefer to, handle that in a different way. And then over time, I get to create a space where I get to start to respond to that uncomfortable situation, thus developing the responsibility, the emotional responsibility. And I do have many areas in my life that I've become pretty practiced at this. However, my finances were not one of them, which I was just made privy to about a month ago when a circumstance arose in my life where I was forced to really dive down into like my financial irresponsibility, my inability to respond to my finances, because for me, it's a deep, deep place of fear and shame and just a big question mark. It's a big unknown for me. I recognize that. I thought there was a circumstance that came up, and I found myself super triggered, and I said, oh, oh my goodness, this is an area that I don't know myself at all. Like, this is an area that I have not spent time. I have covered this up. I feel ashamed. Shame is a huge target for like shame is a huge arrow saying, this is an area that you have not spent time with. Come here, spend time here. So if I go into a triggered space and I feel shame, I know that's where my work is. Shame is one of the most harmful emotions, I believe, yet incredibly important and valid. That's the thing about some emotions. They can really be destructive and prevent forward moving motion. However, when we're able to see that emotion and recognize it as super valid, we can then say, thank you for pointing me to a place within myself that I have not spent time. That's what it is. These triggers, these traumas, these shames, these guilts, these are areas in our life that we have ignored, we have not wanted to go to. And the way for them to be alchemized and moved to the side so that it can not move to the side, we don't ignore these things. The way that they can be alchemized and transmuted and so they can leave our existence is through spending time with them. Validation. No more ignoring. And then we find the ability to respond. And we then become responsible in that area instead of reacting. For me, this continues to be extremely helpful in the understanding of this word. And along with being responsible is, I feel like they're hand in hand, and I haven't been able to really find a separation between the two words, but being responsible and being accountable to me are pretty much the same. They have the same vibration. And right now life has put me in a place where I have been utterly aware of my patterns, utterly aware. I don't have a choice but to see the areas that I'm doing the same thing over and over and over, and it drives me up the wall. And life is asking me to become responsible for those areas, find the ability or develop and practice the ability to respond to these areas. So I don't have to react from a place of shame from that original trauma where I just do what I've been doing my entire life. It's not working. It's not going to work. It's never going to get me to move forward. As a matter of fact, it just continues to be more and more and more uncomfortable. I know I'm not alone in this. I know that many people, if not all people, are experiencing this in different areas of their lives, and probably many in the financial area. So the question that we are being asked is, where can we develop the ability to respond to these areas from a place of full intention, from a place of wholeness and love? Can we respond to these places? So come along with me as we find responsibility, as we start to dive into ourselves, get to know the way that we operate, find, discover, become aware of our tendencies. What do we tend to do? And then ask ourselves, how would we prefer to respond? What's a response that would encourage growth or allow me to move forward? And where do I need to step in and create the ability to respond in such a way? So I hope that this message finds you in a space that's asking for responsibility and it's uncomfortable. You know, the uncomfortable places is where we're going. Those are the places that we are here to alchemize and to learn and to understand, to send love to, so we can start to really get rid of the shame through full responsibility and love. So thank you for listening. I hope you have a fantastic day. I forget what day of the week it is. Oh, Thursday. I hope you have a fantastic Thursday. And thank you for spending your time with me this morning. Mwah.